In her cave, the sorceress was filled with joy. Her plan for longevity had been satisfied as a price had been paid. She had concealed from Kindara that the golden goblet had mystical powers that could eventually draw a man to drink from it. It had easily worked on the prince as a boy too quickly and easily, and it was only a matter of time before he would become a monster, which would grant longevity. In the past, she had tricked common men into believing they could have immense wealth, turning them into creatures. The sacrifice was for her longevity. For the prince, the guarantee of a very long life was assured. Royalty came with great rewards indeed. Confused about the happenings, the frightened prince in his monstrous state sought shelter in the tunnel he found. Morning came, and the king, awaiting his son for their usual morning discussions, got concerned when he didn't show up. He asked the servant if he had seen the prince, but no, she hadn't. Perhaps he had gone out for a morning stroll, the king thought. There was no need for panic. Afternoon came and still, no one had heard from the prince or seen him. At this point, Kindara was nervous and uncomfortable. He went to Prince Tuba's room, and there, shock had him in grips. Everything was scattered. What in the God's name had happened here and to his son? The panicked king wondered. Waking up in the tunnel he had entered the night before, Prince Tuba, now retransformed into his human self, lay down weakly, overly exhausted. Memories of the previous night flashed his mind, and that made him very scared. How could he have transformed into a monster, he wondered. Fearing the harm he might pose to his father or anyone in his proximity, he knew best to keep to himself to figure out what was happening to him. On a farm, an unhappy farmer, Luca, stared at his disturbed crops. Something or someone had been here the night before to destroy his crops. But who would do such a thing to him? Looking about, he saw the unfamiliar footprints of a beast and was alarmed, but if he was any scared, then what he saw next shook his bones. On the floor was a necklace, worn by the prince as a symbol of his authority. Knowing the prince was missing and fearing the worst, he picked up the chain and ran off. Back in the palace, Kindara was blazing in frustration. The worried king sent a word out for the immediate search for his son. It was a frantic search as everyone loved the prince. They searched and searched far and near, determined to find their prince at any cost. Luca arrived at the king's palace. Explaining his findings to an elder, he was immediately called upon to the king's quarters. He showed the necklace to the troubled king, who quickly summoned his warriors and messengers with an order to venture into the woods. For extra hands and personal interest, the king armed himself and joined. He will find his son at any cost, and if indeed he had been attacked by a beast, it was to face the wrath of a raging father. It was a frantic search for Prince Tuba, all agitated. It was becoming a futile search at this point as there was no trace of the prince. Darkness was fast approaching. In a tunnel not far from the search area, Prince Tuba, under the spell of the cursed moon, transformed again into the beast. Hungry and thirsty, he by instinct came out from his hiding in the hope of finding something worth edible. Kindara and his men were not giving up on this mission. Finding nothing worth eating, the prince beast was getting weak. He sighted a young deer grazing by. Pupils dilating, heart pulsating, taste buds increasing, every fiber in him wanted to ravage the creature. After all, he was carnivorous in his monstrous state. The bit of humanity in him wanted to fight the hunger urge, but instinct pushed him to attack. In a swift movement, he caught up with the deer and started feeding on it. Grunting and growling as he ate, a group of searchers were attracted to the sound, moving in his direction. They saw this weird beast they had never seen before. Fear gripped them, and they sounded an alarm. More searchers and warriors joined, and together, they pursued the frightened beast. Unable to tell them who he was, the Prince Beast ran as fast as he could. Kindara and his warriors were at a vantage position when the Prince Beast ran to the direction. Seeing the bloodstains on it from the deer it had earlier attacked, they assumed it might have attacked someone and thus launched an attack on it. The Prince Beast, unable to talk, fought back to survive. The humanity in him wanted to avoid maiming anyone, but his pursuers were bent on killing him. Identifying his father, he by instinct moved towards him in the hope of recognition if his state offered any. The king, assuming this approach for an attack, braced himself, aiming his bow and arrow at him, striking him with a good spring of the arrow. The wounded Prince Beast ran as fast as he could from his attackers, blending into the night such that it could no longer be traced. Entering the tunnel he had for an abode, the injured Prince Beast attended to his wounds, wondering if it would survive the night. In his quarters, the worried king wondered what might have become of his son. No one had any idea whatsoever where he might be. But something struck him, something oddly familiar. In the forest, when the light rays caught the eyes of the beast before he shot his arrow, he felt he had seen those eyes before. The eyes of his son. So he wondered, what if the beast had killed his son and taken on his form? The beast had human features. Perhaps it was a mystical being, a skinwalker that could possess a human. He dismissed these thoughts as they were thoughts of a derailed old man. The new thoughts of his son were making him see and think things. But what he knew most was that his mind would have no rest until he saw his beloved son. It was much later the next morning the Prince Beast transformed into a human, gained some strength. He thought about his predicament. Perhaps, if he could go to his father to tell him what had happened to him before nightfall, they could work out a solution and he wouldn't be worried. After all, he was human during the day, but only a monster at night, he thought. But he knew the injuries he had sustained the night before would hinder his progress if he was to walk out from these woods. In that case, he would arrive late to the palace and would turn into a monster who might attack and maim someone, or worse, get killed himself. For now, he had to attend to his injuries and find something to eat. Slowly, he crept out from his hiding place into the open forest. Seeing a stream up ahead, the tired prince who had been walking for so long was elated. If only he could get to it, he could quench his thirst, he thought. He gathered the strength he could and pursued the purpose. But before he could reach it, his strength gave away, making him fall to the ground in a collapsed state. In their farm nearby, Tiga requested Lida to get some water from the stream. Picking a pot, she set off for the stream. A distance away, Lida saw the motionless prince lying down. Caught with fear, she screamed out to her father, who came rushing through. She pointed out to the prince and carefully, they walked to check him out. They didn't know him to be the prince. But being kind people and seeing how badly in shape he was, Tiga suggested they take him home for treatment. He went for a plank he used to drag big animals, and getting the prince on it, dragged him along. At home, Tiga and Lida washed off the wounds, and Tiga, an experienced hunter with some knowledge of herbs, crushed what was necessary to prevent the wound from festering. He put him in clean attire. Lida cooked him a meal he could eat when he came around. The night was fast approaching. Father and daughter had no idea what they were dealing with. The prince regained consciousness after a while, wondering how he got there. At the same time, the kind Lida brought him soup, asking him to eat to regain his strength. Indeed, he needed this gesture and welcomed it. Lida watched him as he ate, feeling a sense of great admiration for him, one she had never felt for any man. Gaining some strength, Lida and Tiga naturally approached him with questions about who he was and how he got there, as they didn't know him as the prince. A familiar sensation kicked in as the sun began to slowly set. Fearing what was to come, the panicked prince ran out from his wandering host. It made no sense to them why he would take off into the woods while barely strong and when darkness was fast approaching. In eternal as usual, like several nights ago, the prince again transformed into the beast. That night, Lyda dreamt and had unending visions about the prince, who kept shape-shifting into a beast. It was a disturbing one which made no sense to her. But she knew this was something beyond a dream, and she was familiar with the gifts she possessed. The sorceress in her cave counted the days left to gain mortality if the prince was to permanently remain a beast. If he was to ever return to his full human self, it would negatively affect his spell of longevity, but that couldn't be afforded. Tonight again, the prince was a monster. In 2 nights to come, under the power of the blood moon, he would remain a monster forever, and she, immortal. She had lived 2 centuries. 2 more nights will definitely come, she thought. The next day, Lyda dished food into a basket, venturing into the woods. She looked about in search for the prince, having a strong conviction he was around. Yes, he was. In his human form. He was hiding behind a tree, staring at her. If only she knew who I was, she would dare not come close, he said to himself. No one, not even his father, can stand his sight, should he become a monster, he further added. At this point, going back home was not an option. He was nothing but a monster. A few more search and calling out for the prince to come out, and she left, leaving the food behind. She doesn't even know me, yet so kind, he thought. He wished in another circumstance he would know her on personal basis, as he had seen the raw inner and outer beauty she possessed. But no, he was now a beast, a monster who was a danger to anyone daring to come close. Hungry and weary, he went to the food and started eating, grateful for its delicious taste. Back home, it was difficult for Lyda to stop thinking about the handsome prince, yet was bothered about the vision she'd had of him. Why did she dream of him as a beast? Somehow she felt she was the key to this mystery. Kindara kept spreading his tentacles in search of his son. He knew no rest, as finding the prince was his ultimate. The usual transformation happened later that night for Prince Tuba, who was now beginning to accept terms that it was probably his fate, a possible curse he was destined to suffer. 1 more night of transformation and it would be permanent. He never knew. The next day, Lyda again sent food to the woods. This was somewhat of a stupid practice, but for whatever, she felt she was doing what was right. Getting into the heart of the forest, he could sense the prince lurking around. Indeed he was, but hiding as usual. She could strongly feel his presence. You don't have to be alone out here. I could be a friend to talk to, she said, for what it was worth. I brought you some food and water, hoping you can eat while we talk, she added. Indeed, he missed the presence of humans and the ability to talk and explore. This lady had an aura of calmness about herself, and he knew he'd enjoy her company. But I'm not human, he thought. A few more words from her and she turned to leave, leaving the food behind as usual. Few steps away and he crept out from his hiding place. He managed the words, "Thank you." Turning in wonder, she met the face of the handsome man she and her father had saved days ago. "Thanks for everything," he added. "You and your father saved my life, and you care even when you don't know me." By the stream, the rapidly found friends sat and had chats about so many things. They spoke about their childhood days and growing up. It was as though they'd known each other for long. Talking between these two was very easy and comforting. He left out his identity as a prince and, of course, the curse he had to endure. She too kept out the superpower of seeing visions she had and how it had been the reason she had come to live far away with her father. Love was building subtly in their hearts as they spoke deeply and freely. Back in the palace, Kindara, hearing no positive report from anyone, was in terms that the beast from earlier had something to do with his son's disappearance. The prince's necklace had been found in the woods, and blood had been seen on the beast that night. The obvious was feared, but could not be ignored. Vengeance was all that boiled his blood. Not convinced if it had died the day he shot at it, he plotted to go into the woods that night to finish it off in case it had survived. After all, such a beast could not be lurking in his kingdom. Thus, he sent for his commander, telling him his plot. Darkness was fast approaching, and the prince knew what was to come. Standing abruptly, he thanked Lyda for her time, company, and the delicious food. He asked to be excused and turned to leave. "Though a beast at night, you are a beautiful human," she said. Alarmed by this statement, he turned swiftly to her in shock. How could she possibly know, he wondered. Had she seen him ever transform? But how? A million questions raised his mind. Sensing his confusion and knowing this to be true at this point, she told him about her unique abilities and how her visions had always come true. Then, she told him about the visions of him. "Then you're a witch," he said. "No, I am only a gifted child," she countered. "Trust me and I promise things will be better," she assured. With nothing to lose, he opened up about his identity and how he was battling this unknown curse. She was astonished that a prince would endure such an unwarranted curse. He begged her to leave, as it was getting dark and dangerous. Transformation was inevitable. She firmly proposed to stay by him, as she was there for him for a purpose. Tigger back at home was worried as darkness was fast approaching and Lyda was not home. What could have happened to her? He wondered. Lyda in the woods when darkness came was filled with utter fear as right before her eyes, the prince was transforming into a beast. This was just as she had seen in her visions. Her instinct was to run, but she stood her ground to help however way she could. She had given her word. In his full beast personality, the prince was nowhere close to the handsome man a few minutes ago. Tonight, however, felt different for the prince beast. He was charged with ferocious energy and was extremely wild at heart. Being the last night of his transformation where permanency resided, things felt charged. It was as though he was losing part of his humanity. Or maybe all of it. He charged towards her, yet she remained unshaken. She asked him to fight the demonic urge, but this was almost an impossible feat. Gathering courage, she moved to him and placed a hand gently on his chest, soothing his anxiety. A bit of his humanity left. He was shocked at how her calmness could cool his boiling rage. She spoke to him softly to fight his anxieties, assuring him that things would be calm. Tonight was a good one for the sorceress as soon her immortality was assured. By midnight, the transformation would be sealed. Even if the prince died in his monstrous state, the spell would still work. With her palm on his chest, she was transported into a vision where she saw the prince as a young boy, drinking from the goblet. This was the portal that had led to his current fate, she knew instantly. In the still of their calmness, they were heard chants and the approaching sound of running horses. In time, Kindara, escorted by his warriors, caught up with them. Kindara aimed his arrow, the prince beast slipping into his monster mental stage, charging in rage. Before any of the two could strike, Lyda ran in between them, begging the king not to let go. Thus, she was in the way of the king, who had a clear opportunity, and the prince beast. The beast took advantage, running into the night and blending with the darkness. The king ordered for the pursuance of the beast, but this would be futile for the warriors. Angrily, Kindara ordered the arrest of Lyda, who had interfered with the capture of this creature. With his troop, they took her away. In a cell, Kindara demanded furiously from Lyda why she interfered in such a feat, and how she was in the presence of such a monster without fear. "The beast, O king, is your dear son the prince," she said. The enraged king stared at her in wonder if she was mad. She told him about her special gifts and certain things the prince had earlier shared with her. This he knew was impossible for her to know, as some were personal for the knowledge of him and his son only. Her claims that the monster was the prince was illogical, but then, he remembered he had that faint, fleeting feeling before. He asked her how any of this could come to be, and she mentioned the golden goblet in his possession as the portal. This greatly astonished the king, as the golden goblet had been well guarded for years with no mention of it to anyone. How could she know? At this point, he had no choice but to believe. He thought about how easily the sorceress had gifted him riches with nothing asked for in return, then understood the saying that nothing is ever for free, everything had a price. Staring at the golden goblet, the king knew best to destroy this portal. It seemed the only way. Though it would cease the flow of abundance, it was a little price to pay for the restoration of a son. After all, Diambra was flowing with honey and milk. With rage, he flung the golden goblet into a burning furnace, the gold melting eventually. In her cave, the sorceress ready to cast the last of her spell was suddenly caught up in flames. She screamed and shrieked, but her magic's powers and charms were not potent enough to save her from death. Into smoke, she disappeared. In the forest, the prince was suddenly transformed into his natural self, with no trace of anything monstrous. He was greatly astonished, as this was the first of a night he had retransformed into a human before daybreak. At that same time, Tiga, who has been long in search for Lida, came across the prince, who was laying down confused. He helped him up and he explained what had happened to the confused Tiga. The search party came just about the same time and, filled with the joy of seeing their prince, took him with them, the prince asking Tiga to join. Happy seeing the prince, Kindara rushed into his arms, throwing all his love at him. It was an emotional moment for a father and a son who was lost but now found. Kindara apologized immensely to Lida, who explained she was just okay the prince had been restored. He didn't know how to thank Lida, as for her sake, his son had been restored. He gave Lida and Tiga the most comfortable space in his kingdom to reside as their abode. They were now family. Few months later, there was the biggest wedding ever in Diambra, and your guess is as good as mine. Prince Tuba married Lida, and together they lived happily ever after.